Good morning. Today, we're going to continue with this passage after the resurrection. So, yesterday we talked about Thomas and his doubting and how doubt gives us an opportunity to grow closer because we get to ask questions. Today we're looking at the reinstating of Peter. So we're starting on John chapter 21, verses 15, or starting with verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I will tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one whom Jesus leaned back against at the supper and said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said, "Lord, what about him?" We'll cover that tomorrow. So, this passage in John about the reinstating of Peter, it follows the format of 3 times did Peter betray Jesus, or at least 3 times in Scripture we have him in those last days around the trial. We have Peter saying that he did not know Jesus 3 separate times. By the end of that, the cock crows. And so there's the parallel of Jesus asking Peter if he loves him. And then we have that kind of balance out between disassociation with Peter, disassociating himself with Jesus, to 3 times accepting and feeling connected with Jesus. But there's something a little bit deeper here when you get into the Greek. The reality of this is that when you get into the words for love, there are different words for love that Jesus uses. There's 2 ones. He uses phileo, which is kind of like a brotherly love, a love of the soul. There's no romantic implications, but it's a human love, right? There's humanness to it. And then there's agape. And agape is the love of God, this love without requirement or qualification, I guess, is how I'd say it. But for the most part, we understand agape to be one that we strive for, but it's very difficult for humans, if possible at all, because it is a love without our own kind of humanness attached to that. So in this passage, when Jesus starts, he says, do you love me? And uses the word agape. Do you love me with that pure love of God? And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he uses the word phileo. So, it's one of those synonyms, I think, but there's very clear that they're saying 2 different things. Peter's admitting that he's just human in the midst of this. So that's why Jesus asks a second time, "Do you love me?" And he asks with that, once again, Jesus says, "Do you agape me? Do you love me with that love, like I love you, the love of God?" And Peter, once again, says, "I phileo you. I love you as a brother. I love you as best friends. I love you as much as a person can love someone." And that's why in the midst of that, I think Peter's mourning, when it says that Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a 3rd time. But the 3rd time, Jesus changes his wording and says, "Do you phileo me? Do you love me as a brother? Do you love me as a best friend? Do you love me in that way?" And Peter then says, "You know all things. You know that I love you that way." And so this is we can just look at this and go, "Oh, that's really cool. Jesus is willing to change his language." But What I love most about this section is it talks about, or it gives us a picture of God's willingness to come to us, to come down to our level. In Philippians, there's a passage known as the Christological hymn, which talks about how Jesus humbled himself to be, that even though he was God, he humbled himself to die on the cross. And we see that humility continues here. That Jesus is willing to come to Peter's level. That Jesus is willing to look past that, those mistakes, look past that brokenness, and accept him where he is. And that's really kind of cool. That's just actually fundamental to how I understand God and how I've seen God throughout my life, is that the forgiveness of God is not just based on our actions. It's God coming to us. And it's that incarnational way of doing things that God says, if you're not ready, I'm still going to come to you. It's why we don't have to earn salvation, because our own brokenness, our own humanness is not something that God seems to be ashamed of. Rather, it seems to be something that God is willing to reach out through. Does that make sense? Like, to come to us where we are. And we see that in some really cool ways in right here in Scripture, but also to me it's in the way that we are called to work with one another. Right? There's this sense that God works through us imperfect people, no matter what sins we've committed, and we even see that in the Old Testament as Moses had murdered somebody, and David was an adulterer, and he had caused someone else's murder. And we see that there's kind of these larger examples of what we would consider a bigger sin, but God consistently using people that were not known for how great they were. There were a few child prophets, but there were also just as many kings and leaders who were not doing things right, even going so far as at one point to call Nebuchadnezzar blessed, who had caused one of the times that Israel was overtaken, that it lost a war. So God is willing to work with us no matter what. That brings me great hope, because one of my great frustrations when God called me to be a pastor was that everything didn't become perfect and easy in those times. And there's still those days where I kind of feel like Peter, where I'm like, I didn't do this perfectly, or I didn't do this well, but I'm still coming to you, God. That yes, Lord, I love you as much as I can, but I'm still not able to be on your level. So that idea that we're all in different places. I saw this great message. It's probably going to go viral, or already has. That's how I saw it. About how in the midst of this pandemic, we're all kind of in a different place, and the rain for some of us is like the front edge of a hurricane, where it's just it's drizzling at this point, and there's almost a sense of renewal that some people are enjoying their time. They still have their job, and they're able to work from home, and they're learning new things, and taking up a new hobby. And then there's some people in the middle of it where it's storming, and it's still hurting, and there's no sense of peace in it, and it's rocking the world. Maybe lost a job, but still able to kind of hold things together. And then it points out that there's some people who are right now in the midst of this, still in the hurricane, like the worst part of the storm. That is this sense that there are people who are dying, there are people who are working those front lines, or who are struggling even more with mental illness, with anxiety, with depression, with frustration, with loss, and being separated from other people is a really, really hard thing. And so I guess I just want to put this, that if our God is willing to come to us, willing to go to Peter, who betrayed him 3 times, and get down to his level, that our God is with us no matter where we are. If we're feeling renewal right now in the midst of this COVID pandemic, not panic, or if we're in the middle of a hurricane, that God is with us. So I invite you to have that same kind of compassion, that if you see someone with, if you're one of those people that feels somewhat renewed in this time, to have extreme compassion, to step into those other two moments in great effort of prayer, be with those, touch base with folks who are having it harder off. And once heard it best, the harder, the closer you are to the core and of the brokenness and the sorrow, etc., you can pass frustration out to people who have it a little easier. But if you have it a little easier, don't try and pass any frustration back up into that. My prayer for you today is, if this is a time of renewal, may you draw closer to God. If this is a time of storms, may you draw closer to God, but may you also find moments of respite in this. If this is a time of hurricane, that God would strengthen you, that you are not alone, and if there are things that we can do here at the church, or I can do personally, please let me know. And that applies to those of you in the storm too. Somehow I was in the middle of the storm 2 weeks ago, and now somehow I'm on the edge of it. So I understand that I have that privilege, and not everyone gets that. So if there's some way that I can help, or if there's a question you have, then please let me know. And I hope this day can be a little bit of a blessing, no matter how chaotic this time is for you. God bless you.